Picture a crown gleaming in the torchlight of a medieval hall. A crown meant to symbolize power, order, and divine favor. And yet, on the head of Charles VI of France, it became instead a symbol of fragility, a fragile crown for a fragile king. Charles VI ruled for more than 40 years, from 1380 to 1422. His reign began with promise. A boy king destined to inherit the glories of his father, Charles V, and carry France through the storms of the 100 Years' War. But instead, his story became one of blood, betrayal, and madness. A king who believed he was made of glass. A king whose fractured mind mirrored a fractured realm. This is not the tale of victory or triumph. It is the tale of how a nation unraveled beneath the weight of one man's broken mind.
The King of Glass. They said the King of France was made of glass, not in the language of poets, but in his own terrifying conviction. Charles VI, once the golden boy of Paris, lived with the unshakable belief that his bones could shatter at the lightest touch. Courtiers were warned never to approach too suddenly, never to brush his arm, never to clasp his hand in greeting. Before he sat, servants arranged cushions so that his fragile body would not crack against the wooden throne. In his mind, he was not flesh and bone but a crystal vessel, delicate, brittle, always one gesture away from ruin. This was not some private fancy. It ruled his life and, by extension, the life of a kingdom. Imagine the atmosphere of his court. A hush that fell when he entered a room. Nobles and servants moving like shadows, terrified that the smallest misstep might trigger a royal panic. A king who had once been hailed as handsome, vigorous, the very symbol of Valois' strength, now seemed like a specter wrapped in silk and fear. But Charles's glass was not only personal, it was political. By the 1382nd, France itself was brittle. The 100 Years' War smoldered on, taxes were unbearable, and the Black Death still haunted memory. Villages lay half-empty, peasants whispered of revolt, and nobles watched one another with suspicion. In that atmosphere, the sight of a king who moved like a man forever afraid of breaking was more than tragic, it was a dangerous metaphor. Charles had not always been this way. He was crowned at Reims at only 11 years old, inheriting the legacy of his father, Charles V the Wise, a king who had restored some stability after the disasters of plague and war. At first, the boy was no more than a puppet in the hands of his greedy uncles. But as a young man, he seemed to break free. He dismissed them, restored his father's ministers, and gave France a brief taste of order. He was adored in Paris, cheered in the streets, admired for his grace and charisma. Chroniclers described him as a shining hope for a wounded kingdom. And yet the seeds of collapse were already there. His mother had suffered from mental instability. Whispers of hereditary weakness followed him even as he smiled from the saddle. By the early 1392nd, the change was unmistakable. Charles grew suspicious, restless, prone to long silences and sudden rages. There were moments when he seemed not to know himself, or those closest to him. What the medieval mind saw in this affliction was not medicine but omen. Priests spoke of God's punishment, physicians muttered about poisoned humors, and commoners spread rumors of sorcery. But whatever the explanation, one fact became clear. The king who believed himself made of glass could not hold together a kingdom already full of cracks. The delusion carried powerful symbolism in an age that prized allegory. Glass was rare and mysterious in the 14th century. It was transparent yet sharp, pure yet perilous. To believe oneself made of glass was to embody fragility, but also a strange kind of sanctity, untouchable, translucent, set apart. Charles's terror spoke the language of his age, but it also stripped him of authority. What general could command armies if he feared a handshake? What ruler could hold the reins of state when even sitting on a chair required ritual? The palace adapted. Servants tiptoed, courtiers rehearsed gentleness. Physicians prescribed bleedings, holy baths, and charms. Priests offered whispered exorcisms. Astrologers searched the heavens for signs of relief. Outside the palace walls, Paris traded rumors like coins. Some said the queen must secretly rule in his place. Others whispered that dukes circled, waiting to tear the crown apart. And always the people prayed not just for the king's health, but for the fragile fate of France itself. There were days of lucidity, mornings when Charles laughed with his children or spoke wisely with his council. Those hours were precious, like a thaw in midwinter, but everyone knew the ice waited beneath. The court lived suspended between hope and dread, for each return of reason seemed only to foreshadow the next plunge into madness. And so our story begins not on a battlefield, nor in a council chamber, but with a man afraid of his own body, a monarch lowering himself slowly, carefully, onto a chair cushioned as though for a relic. A king of glass, in a kingdom of fractures, one man's madness, reflecting the fragility of an entire realm. When Charles VI first wore the crown of France, it was almost comical, a golden weight so large that servants steadied it as it slid down his boyish brow. He was only 11 years old, a child made monarch by his father's sudden death. The coronation at Reims glittered with incense and jewels, but beneath the pageantry, the truth was stark. France had placed its survival in the hands of a boy. His father, Charles V the Wise, had been respected, learned, cautious, patient. He had rebuilt a nation battered by war and plague. But his son inherited only turmoil. The 100 Years' War still bled the kingdom dry, villages lay hollow after the Black Death, and the treasury trembled under debts. An 11-year-old could not steer such a storm. And so the reins passed to his uncles, the Dukes of Burgundy, Berry, and Anjou. These men ruled not as guardians, but as predators. They drained the treasury, sold favors, demanded taxes. To the Parisians, their government felt like a swarm of leeches fattening on the body of the state. Riots broke out, peasants whispered curses, merchants closed their shutters when royal collectors passed. The boy king, meanwhile, stood in silks while his kingdom seethed. But in 1388, a change came that electrified France. Charles, now 20, dismissed his greedy uncles and restored his father's circle of ministers, sober men called the marmosets. These were not warlike dukes, but administrators, men of law and finance. They reformed taxation, steadied coinage, and gave hope to commoners who had nearly forgotten what honest government looked like. Paris erupted in celebration. At last the boy had shown himself a king, and Charles seemed worthy of the moment. Chroniclers remember him as tall, handsome, with a grace that won hearts. He loved tournaments, laughed easily, and rode through the streets like a hero out of legend. Flowers rained down from windows. Songs were written in his honor. For the first time in years, France dared to imagine stability. But fate is cruel. The boy carried shadows in his blood. His mother, Jeanne of Bourbon, had been plagued by mental afflictions. Whispers followed Charles from childhood that the crown of Valois carried not only gold, but madness. At first, no one wanted to believe it. The young king seemed too bright, too full of promise. Yet by the early 1392, the whispers grew louder. He grew restless. His eyes darted in suspicion. He muttered of betrayal, even from loyal men. At feasts, he sometimes forgot names, even faces. He walked halls in endless circles, as though lost in some invisible maze. Courtiers noticed he flinched at touch, recoiled from embraces, stared into space as if listening to voices no one else could hear. Physicians blamed hot summers and imbalanced humors. Priests called for prayers. But among the people of Paris, explanations were darker. They said he had been bewitched, or cursed, or struck by God's punishment. Madness, in the medieval imagination, was never mere illness. It was moral, spiritual, cosmic. A king losing his reason meant a kingdom sliding toward ruin. And yet hope clung stubbornly. France remembered the boy who had defied his uncles, who had restored good governance, who had once carried himself like a knight from a song. They told themselves this was a passing fever, that their king would recover and lead them once more. But in the summer of 1392, that hope shattered. Riding through the forest of Le Mans, Charles suddenly drew his sword not against enemies, but against his own escort. His eyes wild, his voice screaming of betrayal, he struck down loyal companions in a frenzy that horrified even hardened soldiers. When the madness passed, blood lay on the soil, and the Valois crown had changed forever. The boy king was gone. In his place stood a ruler fractured, unpredictable, already sliding into the glass delusion that would haunt the rest of his reign. And France, a kingdom already brittle, would begin to crack with him. The morning sun burned white on the helmets of the royal escort as they rode through the forest of Le Mans. Dust curled up behind the hooves, and the young king, 24 and radiant in polished armor, rode at their head. It should have been a triumphal journey. Charles VI marching to punish a traitor, to prove his strength against rebellion. Instead, it became the moment France realized its king was slipping beyond their reach. The plan had been simple. One of Charles's old counselors, Pierre de Craon, had attempted to murder a friend of the crown and fled into Brittany. The king, furious, led an armed force to demand justice. The army was large but orderly, the forest cool and green. Yet those riding with him sensed something brittle in their sovereign. He had not slept well. His eyes flashed with suspicion. At times he spoke as if conspirators trailed just out of sight. And then it happened. A ragged figure stumbled from the trees, barefoot, half mad, shouting, "King, do not ride further. You are betrayed." The words seemed to crack something inside Charles. A knight moved to hush the man, but it was too late. The king's gaze darkened. His hand reached for his sword. Without warning, Charles wheeled on his own escort. His blade flashed, striking down one of his companions. Panic rippled through the column. Courtiers cried out, soldiers raised shields, but the king's fury only deepened. He slashed again and again, screaming of treason, striking comrades who had ridden faithfully at his side for years. 4 men lay dead before anyone could subdue him. When the frenzy passed, silence fell heavy as stone. The king sagged in the saddle, eyes vacant, as though the fire had burned out all recognition. His surviving knights stared in horror not only at the bodies of their brothers, but at the man who had killed them, their anointed king, God's chosen ruler. If the king's mind was broken, what of the kingdom itself? They carried him back to Paris in secret, cloaking the truth in half-whispers. Chroniclers write of a court plunged into chaos. Counselors weeping, the queen terrified, the dukes already circling. The people of Paris muttered that God had cursed the Valois line. Some whispered sorcery, others remembered his mother's affliction and shook their heads. It was not magic, but blood. For weeks, Charles drifted in and out of awareness. At times, he recognized no one. He spoke to empty air, or wandered halls muttering. He refused to bathe or change his clothes, until lice swarmed his body. At moments, he raged, lashing out at servants. At others, he crumpled into despair, unable to speak, eyes hollow. This was not the passing fever his people had prayed for. It was something deeper, darker, a fracture running straight through the crown. The political consequences were immediate. With the king incapacitated, power seeped into other hands. His uncles returned, those same greedy dukes Charles had dismissed in his youth. They called it guardianship. In truth, it was plunder reborn. The treasury once again groaned beneath corruption. While factions formed around the rival branches of the royal family, the Burgundians on one side, the Armagnacs on the other. France was becoming a battlefield not only of armies but of ambitions, with the king himself reduced to a shadow. And all the while, ordinary Parisians saw only the shell of their monarch. A man who had once dazzled them in golden armor, now wandering his chambers, muttering that he was fragile, that he was glass, that one touch might shatter him to pieces. The tragedy was double-edged, for when Charles regained lucidity, he often remembered everything, the blood he had spilled, the shame of his rages. He wept, begged forgiveness, swore to do better. For a time he would govern wisely, meeting with counselors, signing decrees, but always the darkness returned. Sudden, merciless, unpredictable. France lived as if walking on cracked ice, never knowing when the next fracture would open. That day in the forest marked the beginning of a reign defined not by victories in battle or treaties signed, but by breakdowns. And in a kingdom already fragile, the king's madness became not just a private sorrow, but a public disaster. The King of France had drawn his sword against his own men, and the shadow of that act would haunt him and his country for the rest of his life. Paris glittered with torches that January night in 1393. The Queen, Isabeau of Bavaria, had arranged a masquerade ball to lighten the court's heavy spirits. Her husband, Charles VI, had only recently emerged from another spell of madness, and the nobility clung desperately to moments of gaiety, as though laughter could seal the cracks spreading through the crown. The hall was a blaze of light and silk. Music thundered, goblets clinked, and courtiers in jeweled masks swirled across the floor. It was supposed to be harmless revelry, but the court of France never did anything lightly. The Queen had devised a spectacle. 6 noblemen, including the king himself, would dress as wild men, half-beasts of the forest, symbols of untamed nature. The costumes were grotesque, stitched from linen soaked in pitch and covered in flax fibers that bristled like hair. They clung tightly to the dancers' bodies, turning them into shaggy creatures. To complete the illusion, chains bound them together as they howled and leapt, sending the court into shrieks of delighted horror. The king himself, hidden beneath the costume, capered with abandon, freed for a moment from the burden of rule. But no one could ignore the danger. The pitch-soaked linen was highly flammable. And yet, the performance went on, laughter echoing against the vaulted ceiling. Then, the fatal moment. Louis of Orléans, the king's own brother, entered the hall late, already drunk. In one hand, he carried a torch. Ignoring warnings, he strode toward the dancers, laughing, waving the flame too close. A spark leapt. In an instant, one of the wild men's costumes erupted into fire. The hall exploded in screams. The pitch caught like dry tinder. Flames raced from one dancer to the next, chains binding them together in a living inferno. Courtiers scattered, some knocking over tables, others frozen in horror. The shrieks of the burning men filled the chamber, their grotesque costumes turning to cages of fire. Charles himself survived only by chance. His aunt, the Duchess of Berry, had the presence of mind to throw her heavy skirts over him, smothering the flames before they could consume him. 4 others were not so lucky. Before the horrified eyes of the French court, noblemen were burned alive, their bodies collapsing in blackened heaps on the dance floor where only moments earlier they had capered in jest. The spectacle, meant to amuse, became a vision of hell. The people of Paris were outraged. Word spread swiftly through the city the king had nearly burned to death in a foolish masquerade, while others perished horribly beside him. Rumors grew that the court was cursed, that the king's madness had invited divine punishment. Priests thundered from pulpits, condemning the indecency of such festivities. The monarchy, already fragile, reeled under the weight of public scorn. For Charles, the event left a lasting scar. Though he had escaped the fire, he did not escape the terror. Chroniclers wrote that he seemed shaken afterward, drifting again into suspicion and silence. For those who had witnessed it, the Bal des Ardents was more than an accident. It was a grim symbol of a kingdom dancing on the edge of disaster, where one careless spark could ignite catastrophe. In the years that followed, the court's reputation for extravagance only deepened resentment. Nobles squabbled, the treasury drained, and the people looked to their king only to see a man increasingly lost in delusion. The fire that had nearly consumed him at the masquerade seemed to live on in his mind, a blaze no physician or priest could ever quench. The king who once dreamed of chivalry now haunted his own palace, half man, half shadow, carrying not the costume of a wild man, but the burden of a mind unraveling. And outside the palace walls, France whispered that God's fury had already chosen its vessel. By the early 1402, whispers of madness clung to Charles VI like a second cloak. His court had grown accustomed to sudden rages, long silences, and terrifying lapses of recognition. Yet nothing unnerved them more than the delusion that would define his reign, the belief that his body was made of glass. It began quietly. Courtiers noticed that the king refused handshakes or embraces. He sat stiffly, avoiding contact, as though even a brush of fingers might shatter him. Before long, his fear grew so consuming that he ordered his clothes reinforced with iron rods, sewn secretly into his garments to protect his fragile bones. Whenever he traveled, cushions were piled high on chairs and benches so that he would not risk breaking against hard wood. The delusion was no passing fancy. To Charles, it was absolute truth. He warned his physicians not to come too close, begged servants to move softly, and trembled if anyone entered a room too suddenly. Chroniclers described him clutching at his limbs as if to hold himself together, eyes wild with terror that a stumble, a fall, even a touch could shatter him into shards. For his courtiers, the effect was devastating. A medieval king was supposed to be solid, commanding, a figure of steel at the heart of war. To see their monarch afraid of his own body was to watch authority dissolve into dust. How could such a man lead armies? How could he embody France when he believed himself as fragile as a goblet on the edge of a table? And yet, the image carried terrible symbolism. Glass was rare and mysterious in the 14th century. It was transparent, fragile, but also pure. Some scholars later argued that Charles's delusion reflected the anxieties of his age. A monarch both sacred and breakable, an emblem of a kingdom stretched to its limit. But for those forced to serve him, it was no metaphor, it was a nightmare. The court adapted. Guards were instructed never to jostle him. Servants rehearsed elaborate rituals to ensure he felt safe when sitting or rising. Some nobles mocked him in whispers. Others pitied him, but all were trapped by the same reality. The king's body, whether of flesh or glass, held the fate of France. And the kingdom was crumbling. With Charles often incapacitated, his uncles and his brother Louis of Orléans seized power again, exploiting the vacuum for wealth and influence. Soon, rival factions formed: the Armagnacs on one side, loyal to Orléans, and the Burgundians on the other, led by the powerful Duke of Burgundy. What began as a struggle for influence over a broken king would soon explode into civil war. Meanwhile, the people of Paris muttered bitterly. They heard stories of the king refusing to bathe, of him wandering the palace filthy and unkempt, of lice crawling beneath his crown. They heard of his belief in his glass body and shook their heads. Two peasants who had buried children from famine and plague, a monarch who feared breaking like a wine flask, was not a tragic figure, he was a dangerous liability. Yet even in the depths of his madness, Charles had lucid moments that tormented him. When clarity returned, he remembered. He wept for the companions he had killed in the forest. He shuddered at the flames of the burning ball. He begged forgiveness from God and his people, swearing to govern wisely. And for a brief time, he did. But always the darkness returned. Always the fragile glass shimmered in his mind, threatening to crack. The Valois dynasty, once proud, now seemed to stand on glass legs as well. Every decision, every alliance, every treaty risked shattering beneath the weight of civil strife. The king's body and the kingdom itself mirrored each other, fragile, fractured, and frighteningly easy to break. In a court where one man believed himself made of glass, France itself was slipping towards splintering. And as the king withdrew further into delusion, his rivals sharpened their blades, not against England this time, but against each other. Paris, 1407. The air was sharp with winter, the kind that carried sound across cobbled streets like a knife through silence. Torches flickered along the Seine, and the city slept uneasily under the weight of rumors. Everyone knew the kingdom was divided. On one side, Louis of Orléans, the king's ambitious brother. On the other, John the Fearless, Duke of Burgundy, cold-eyed and calculating. At the center sat Charles VI, fragile and unreliable, his crown a prize for whichever faction could grasp it. Louis had always been a lightning rod. Handsome, cultured, and ambitious, he was beloved by many Parisians but despised by his rivals. He spent lavishly on art, music, and lovers. His affair with Queen Isabeau was whispered about in every tavern, scandal and gossip feeding the fires of resentment. More dangerous still, Louis controlled the king's seal during Charles's episodes of madness, signing decrees in his brother's name. To his enemies, he was not merely overreaching, he was usurping. John of Burgundy hated him most of all. Their rivalry had simmered for years, fueled by jealousy, politics, and blood-feud pride. In November of that year, John decided to end it, permanently. On the evening of the 23rd of November, Louis was summoned from the Hotel St. Paul, the royal palace. He rode through the dark streets with only a few attendants, confident, perhaps careless. As his horse clattered down the Rue Vieille du Temple, a group of armed men waited in the shadows. They struck swiftly. A halberd blow shattered his arm. Another cleaved his skull. Swords slashed, torches flared, and within moments the Duke of Orléans lay butchered in the street, his body hacked so viciously that witnesses claimed it was nearly unrecognizable. His horse bolted riderless into the night. Paris awoke to shock. The king's own brother, murdered in cold blood at the heart of the capital. Panic spread through the court. Who was safe if royal blood could be spilled so brazenly? Rumors twisted instantly. Some blamed English agents, others a jealous husband, but soon the truth emerged. John the Fearless had ordered it, and he did not deny it. Instead, he justified it. From pulpits and pamphlets, Burgundian lawyers proclaimed that the murder was not a crime, but an act of tyrannicide. They painted Louis as a corrupter of the realm, a man who drained the treasury, seduced the queen, and led France toward ruin. John, they claimed, had acted as God's instrument, purging the kingdom of a dangerous parasite. The argument worked better than anyone expected. Crowds in Paris, weary of Louis's extravagance and higher taxes, cheered the Duke of Burgundy as a savior. When he returned to the capital, he was greeted with flowers, music, and cries of "Long live John the Fearless." But not everyone accepted this theater of justification. Louis's allies, led by his son-in-law Bernard of Armagnac, burned with fury. They declared war on Burgundy, rallying nobles to their cause. From then on, France was torn between two camps, the Armagnacs and the Burgundians, each claiming to defend the crown, each willing to spill French blood for power. And at the center of it all sat Charles VI, the King of Glass, drifting in and out of madness, sometimes lucid enough to sign decrees, other times so lost in delusion he could barely recognize his wife or children. His incapacity was the void into which murder and faction had rushed, a void now widening into civil war. The assassination of Louis of Orléans was more than a crime of passion or a dynastic squabble. It was the crack of glass under strain, the sound of a kingdom shattering. France, already weakened by the 100 Years' War, now turned its swords inward. Neighbors became enemies, cities became battlegrounds, and brother once again fought brother. And in the smoky streets of Paris, where the blood of a prince still stained the cobbles, the people whispered what they had always feared. Their king was broken, and with him, so was France. After the blood of Orléans stained the Parisian cobbles, France descended into a spiral of chaos. What had once been a rivalry of dukes now exploded into open civil war. The Armagnacs, sworn to avenge Louis of Orléans, rallied around his young son Charles and the fierce Count of Armagnac. The Burgundians, led by John the Fearless, wielded the murder itself as a weapon of propaganda, claiming they had purged France of corruption. Paris became the first battlefield. Burgundian supporters filled the streets, shouting slogans, seizing control of guilds, stirring the people with promises of cheaper bread and just rule. Meanwhile, Armagnac partisans whispered in taverns, armed their retainers, and plotted revenge. The Seine itself seemed to divide loyalties. On one bank, Burgundian banners, on the other, Armagnac steel. And all the while, the king, the man who should have united them, wandered in and out of lucidity. Sometimes, Charles VI sat solemnly on his throne, listening to petitions as though nothing were amiss. At other times, he cowered in corners, refusing to be touched, insisting that he was glass and must not be broken. In those moments, power passed entirely to whichever faction had his seal in hand. The rivalry spread beyond Paris. Cities across France were forced to declare for one side or the other. Burgundian influence stretched through the wealthy towns of Flanders and northern France. The Armagnacs tightened their grip on the south, bolstered by ties to Gascony and alliances through marriage. Castles, once symbols of feudal pride, now became garrisons bristling with men preparing to march not against the English, but against fellow Frenchmen. The ordinary people paid the heaviest price. Taxes multiplied, food prices soared, and armies Armagnac or Burgundian, it mattered little, pillaged as they passed. Villages were torched in the name of vengeance. Farmers fled to the woods. Mothers buried their dead children in shallow graves as mercenaries trampled their fields. France, already scarred by plague and foreign war, now turned its blade inward with savage efficiency. The University of Paris, once a center of scholarship, split along factional lines. Priests thundered contradictory sermons. Some declared the Burgundians champions of justice, others hailed the Armagnacs as defenders of true order. Even the saints seemed divided, invoked by both sides to sanctify slaughter. In the midst of this chaos, England watched. King Henry IV had already tested French defenses with raids across the Channel. But when his son, Henry V, ascended the English throne in 1413, the opportunity became irresistible. Here was France, once proud and united under Charles V, now crumbling like rotted timber. A mad king, rival dukes, civil war, it was an invitation carved in gold for an ambitious conqueror. But France could not see beyond its own quarrel. When Burgundians stormed Paris in 1413, they massacred Armagnac supporters, hanging men from street corners, their corpses swaying above markets as warnings. When the Armagnacs regained control a year later, they repaid blood with blood. The capital became a theater of revenge, its citizens trapped between shifting tides of cruelty. Chroniclers write of neighbors betraying neighbors, of children dragged from homes to be punished for their father's loyalties. And through it all, Charles remained the tragic figurehead, sometimes clear-eyed, even tender, sometimes utterly lost in terror and delusion. At times, he recognized the horror consuming his kingdom and wept openly. At other times, he sat smiling vacantly while rival dukes plotted murder in his name. France was no longer a realm. It was a carcass, torn between wolves. And on the horizon, across the Channel, England's young king prepared to cross the water and claim it for himself. In 1415, the storm finally broke. While France bled itself dry in civil war, Henry V of England assembled an army across the Channel. He was young, hardened by rebellion in his youth, and hungry for conquest. To him, France was not merely a rival kingdom, it was an inheritance denied, a crown he believed rightfully his through Edward III's old claim. With Charles VI lost in madness and his dukes at each other's throats, Henry saw the moment had come. He landed at Harfleur with banners snapping in the wind and engines of war rolling onto French soil. The siege was brutal. Disease tore through both sides, but the English endured, forcing the port town into surrender. Yet their army was weakened, exhausted, and burdened with sick men. Still, Henry pressed on, marching his force toward Calais, daring the French to stop him. The French obliged. Word raced through the countryside, and knights rallied to the oriflamme, the sacred banner of France. Thousands upon thousands answered the call. Chroniclers claimed 20,000, perhaps even 30,000 men gathered under the fleur-de-lis. Against them marched Henry with scarcely 6,000, many of them archers, mud-caked and weary from weeks of hunger. It was madness or genius. The two armies met near the village of Agincourt on the 25th of October, the feast of Street Crispin. Rain had turned the fields into a swamp of sticky clay. The French knights, resplendent in shining armor, believed victory was certain. They outnumbered the English 3, even 4 to 1. Behind their visors, they laughed at the thought of scattering Henry's ragged host. But the English king knew his ground. He placed his archers on the flanks, behind sharpened stakes, their longbows strung and ready. When the French cavalry charged, the arrows fell like hail, iron-tipped rain, piercing mail, killing horses, sowing chaos. Knights slipped in the mud, dragged down by their own heavy armor. Men crushed one another in the press, suffocating before they ever reached the English line. Henry's soldiers, though outnumbered, fought with grim determination. Armed with poleaxes and daggers, they hacked down knights worth a dozen peasants' ransoms. The battlefield became a slaughterhouse. Chroniclers describe heaps of armored corpses piled so high that men stumbled over them as over fallen walls. The mud sucked at the dead, swallowing them whole. By day's end, thousands of French nobles lay dead. The Constable of France, the Duke of Alençon, countless knights whose names had filled courtly rolls of honor. Among the English, only a few hundred perished. It was not merely a defeat, it was humiliation. seared into the very soul of France. In Paris, grief and panic spread like plague. The king was incapable of responding, raving in his chambers, unable to even comprehend the disaster. His queen and councillors quarreled, while English heralds proclaimed Henry's triumph across Europe. France, divided and leaderless, had been struck like an anvil under a single hammer blow. The victory at Agincourt was more than a battle won. It was a prophecy fulfilled that a kingdom with a mad king and warring dukes could not stand against a united enemy. Henry V had proven it with blood. And though France still breathed, it bled heavily. Its spirit cracked like glass under strain. The disaster at Agincourt did not unite France. Instead, it deepened the fissures. The Armagnacs and Burgundians sharpened their hatred, each blaming the other for the catastrophe. While Henry V pressed his advantage, the French nobility chose not reconciliation but vengeance. In 1419, hope briefly flickered. The young Dauphin Charles, son of the Mad King, arranged to meet John the Fearless on a bridge at Montereau. Perhaps, some dared to believe, the factions might reconcile at last, bind wounds, and resist the English together. But Montereau was no place of peace. As words turned sharp, Armagnac swords were drawn. Before his men could intervene, John the Fearless was struck down, his skull split by an axe. The Duke of Burgundy lay dead at the Dauphin's feet. The murder sent shockwaves across Christendom. The Dauphin had destroyed any chance of reconciliation. Instead of rallying France, the act drove Burgundy into England's arms. John's heir, Philip the Good, furious and unyielding, sealed an alliance with Henry V that would forever alter the fate of the kingdom. The alliance bore fruit 2 years later. In 1420, the Treaty of Troyes was signed, one of the most infamous documents in French history. In it, Charles VI, still broken in mind and spirit, was compelled to recognize Henry V of England not as enemy, but as heir. The treaty disinherited the Dauphin Charles entirely, declaring him illegitimate, unworthy of the crown. Instead, upon Charles VI's death, the crown of France would pass to the King of England. Paris wept and raged. To many, it was nothing short of betrayal. The king they still called the Beloved in his lucid moments had bartered away their birthright. Yet the treaty was signed, sealed, and celebrated by those who stood to profit, Burgundians eager for revenge, English envoys exultant at their triumph, and courtiers too fearful or greedy to protest. For Henry V, it was victory greater than any battlefield. He married Catherine of Valois, daughter of Charles VI, uniting the crowns in flesh as well as parchment. Chroniclers describe the wedding as both splendid and ominous, with golden cloth shimmering beside whispers of treachery. The child of this union, they said, would be king of both realms, England and France, one crown, one ruler. Yet, even as triumph filled English hearts, tragedy loomed. Henry V, young and strong, seemed destined to reign for decades. But fate, as it had with Charles, played cruelly. Only 2 years after Troyes, he fell ill and died suddenly at 35, leaving an infant son as heir. Still, the damage to France was done. The kingdom was carved between two masters, the English in Paris, propped by their Burgundian allies, and the Dauphin Charles in the south, clinging to scraps of legitimacy. And above them all, in the twilight of his life, Charles VI drifted deeper into shadows. His crown had been promised to another. His realm was fractured beyond recognition. The Treaty of Troyes was more than parchment. It was the shattering of French pride, the culmination of decades of madness, murder, and betrayal. And for the people who once hailed their monarch as Charles the Beloved, it was proof that a broken king could break a nation. By the early 1422, the French crown was little more than a hollow symbol. The Treaty of Troyes had branded the Dauphin a bastard, Henry V had taken Catherine of Valois as wife, and Paris lay under English and Burgundian control. And yet, in the halls of the Hotel Saint-Paul, Charles VI still wandered the forgotten king, drifting between moments of lucidity and long descents into madness. The once proud monarch had become a ghost in his own palace. Chroniclers describe him stumbling through corridors, filthy and unkempt, his nails grown long, lice crawling beneath his crown. Sometimes he refused to be bathed or dressed. Other times he stared at his courtiers with vacant eyes, unable to recognize even his wife or children. On rare days, clarity returned. He wept at the memory of his sins, begged forgiveness of God, and mourned the kingdom that had collapsed around him. Then, just as swiftly, the darkness returned. In 1422, fate delivered its final cruelty. Henry V, triumphant conqueror and heir to the French crown, died suddenly of dysentery at the age of 35. His infant son, Henry VI, was proclaimed heir to both England and France. It should have been a chance for France to reclaim itself. But Charles VI had no strength left to seize it. On the 21st of October, 1422, Charles died in Paris at the age of 53. Chroniclers say his death was quiet, almost unnoticed, overshadowed by the looming power struggle between Armagnac loyalists, Burgundians, and English occupiers. At the moment of his passing, he was no longer King of France in his own right by treaty. His crown had already been handed to an English child. The streets of Paris did not mourn him. Some wept, but many whispered with bitterness. To them, Charles was not the beloved, but the mad, the king who had danced in burning halls, who thought himself made of glass, who murdered companions in the forest, who surrendered France to foreign rule. His reign had spanned 42 years, but of those, fewer than half were lucid. The rest had been consumed by delusion, manipulation, and bloodshed. And yet, in the ruins he left behind, a strange legend was born. Chroniclers could not ignore the tragic poetry of his life. A king who believed himself fragile, and whose kingdom shattered like glass around him. His madness became more than sickness, it became symbol. To the Burgundians, proof of God's punishment. To the Armagnacs, a wound that demanded vengeance. To later generations, a cautionary tale of power undone by frailty. But history does not end with Charles. Even as his body lay in the Basilica of Saint-Denis, voices began to rise in defiance. In the south, the Dauphin Charles, disinherited by Troyes, mocked as a bastard, prepared to fight for his birthright. And within a decade, a peasant girl from Domremy, named Jean, would hear voices that claimed heaven itself, demanded France be saved. Charles VI died broken, but his death marked the turning of an age. Out of his ruin would rise both the darkest humiliations and the most astonishing redemptions of French history. His madness had nearly delivered the kingdom to England, but his legacy, twisted, tragic, unforgettable, ensured that France would never forget how fragile a crown could be.